April 9th, 1940. The fjords above Narvik, Norway. A British Royal Marine lay flat against frozen rock, snow melting into his collar, listening to a sound he had never heard in any training exercise back home. It began as a low mechanical stutter, then rose into something closer to tearing canvas. Fast, relentless, impossible to count in individual shots. Somewhere above him on the ridgeline, a German MG34 team had found his position. And for the first time in the war, an Allied soldier understood that this conflict would sound different from the last one. Britain had rushed troops to Norway in a desperate bid to deny Germany its iron ore supply routes and secure a foothold in Scandinavia before Hitler could close it off entirely. The campaign was hastily planned, poorly supplied, and fought across brutal Arctic terrain that neither side had trained for. Yet it was here, in the narrow valleys around Narvik, that many British soldiers first encountered the sound that would follow Allied armies across 5 years and every theatre of the war. Unlike the older Lewis and Vickers guns familiar to British troops, the MG34 fired at a cyclic rate more than double what most soldiers had ever experienced, its bursts blending into a continuous shriek rather than a rhythmic chatter. Marines pinned along the fjord's edge described losing all sense of how many weapons were firing at them, the sound seeming to come from every direction across the rock walls that echoed and multiplied it. Norway's campaign ended in withdrawal by early June, overshadowed almost immediately by the catastrophe unfolding in France. But the soldiers who survived those fjords carried something back with them beyond simple defeat, a sound memory etched early that veterans decades later would still describe with the same visceral clarity, insisting that no photograph or newsreel ever captured what German machine gun fire actually sounded like from the receiving end. Within weeks, that same sound would greet British and French soldiers across an entire continent as German forces launched their invasion west, and the fjords of Norway became merely the first entry in a list of battlefields that would come to define a generation's most persistent nightmare. October 23rd, 1942. The Western Desert, El Alamein, Egypt. Private Thomas Ashworth of the British 8th Army crouched in a slit trench as the night sky erupted with the largest artillery barrage the Desert War had yet seen. Nearly 900 guns opening fire simultaneously to mark the beginning of Bernard Montgomery's offensive against Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa. But it was not the artillery Ashworth would remember most vividly decades later. It was what came after, when infantry advanced through cleared minefield lanes and German defensive positions opened fire in response. Rommel's forces, though stretched thin and desperately short of fuel, had spent months constructing defensive belts thick with mutually supporting MG34 and early MG42 positions, dug deep into the desert sand and camouflaged against a landscape offering almost no natural cover. Commonwealth soldiers, British, Australian, New Zealand, South African and Indian troops fighting alongside one another, advanced into fields where a single misjudged step could trigger not only mines, but the attention of 2 or 3 interlocking machine guns at once. The desert's flat, open terrain carried sound differently than the forests and hedgerows soldiers would later fight through in Europe. There was no vegetation to muffle or scatter it, only sand and stone that seemed to amplify the weapon's tearing report across enormous distances, allowing a single well-placed gun to dominate psychologically far beyond its actual range. Australian veterans of the battle later described advancing units that would freeze entirely at the first burst, some men requiring physical shoves from officers and NCOs to continue moving forward through open ground. By November 4th, after 12 days of grinding attritional combat, Rommel's line finally broke and Axis forces began the long retreat that would eventually carry them out of North Africa entirely. Yet, for the Commonwealth soldiers who fought through El Alamein's minefields, the sound of German machine gun fire across open desert became a reference point they would measure every subsequent battle against, a baseline of dread that later fighting in Italy and France would only deepen rather than replace. As victory parades celebrated the desert campaign's end back home, soldiers who had survived the advance carried forward hard lessons in fire discipline and coordinated assault that would prove essential when Allied forces crossed the Mediterranean towards Sicily within the year. July 10th, 1943, the beaches of Sicily, American and British forces launched Operation Husky under difficult conditions, high winds scattering paratrooper drops and complicating naval landings along the island's southern coast. Yet as troops pushed inland through the following weeks, it was not the amphibious assault itself, but the mountainous interior terrain that produced some of the campaign's most brutal fighting. German and Italian defenders using Sicily's rugged hills to construct exactly the kind of defensive positions machine gun doctrine was built for. Near the town of Troina, in early August, American infantry of the 1st Infantry Division faced 8 days of intense combat against German paratroopers, and Panzer Grenadier units dug into terraced hillsides above the town. MG42 positions, sited with commanding views across approach routes, forced repeated costly assaults before American forces finally secured the position. Soldiers who fought through Troina described a specific dread that developed around any silence in the surrounding hills, an unnatural quiet that experienced troops learned often preceded renewed machine gun fire from a position that had simply gone still to conserve ammunition. By mid-August, as German forces successfully evacuated much of their garrison across the Strait of Messina despite Allied pursuit, American General George Patton's controversial race across the island had captured Palermo and pushed the campaign to its conclusion. Sicily fell within 38 days, but the lessons learned in its hills travelled directly across the narrow strait, separating the island from mainland Italy, where an even more punishing campaign awaited. September brought landings at Salerno, where German counterattacks nearly drove the invasion back into the sea during its first critical days. Machine gun positions, integrated with artillery and armour, created a defensive depth that Allied planners had underestimated, and soldiers who survived Salerno's beachhead carried forward an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how thoroughly German infantry doctrine had been built around the weapon's psychological and tactical effect, a lesson that would be tested again more brutally within months at a beachhead further up Italy's coast. January 22nd, 1944, Anzio, Italy. Allied forces landed north of the German defensive lines in a bold attempt to outflank the stalemate developing further south, hoping speed and surprise would carry them quickly inland toward Rome. Instead, cautious follow-up decisions allowed German forces under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring time to rush reinforcements to the area, and within days the Anzio beachhead had transformed from a mobile offensive into a static siege that would last nearly 4 months. Soldiers dug into the flat, exposed terrain around Anzio found themselves living almost entirely underground, trenches and dugouts offering the only real protection from German artillery, observed from surrounding high ground and from the machine gun fire that swept the beachhead's perimeter at irregular intervals throughout both day and night. Unlike the brief, intense engagements of earlier campaigns, Anzio's soldiers experienced something closer to prolonged psychological siege, the distinctive tearing sound of MG42 fire becoming an almost constant background presence rather than an isolated moment of terror. Medical officers serving at Anzio began documenting unusually high rates of what was then termed battle fatigue among troops who had endured weeks of the beachhead's grinding routine, and several later noted a peculiar recurring detail in soldiers' accounts: an inability to fully relax even during quiet periods, and persistent listening for a sound that experienced troops now recognized instinctively before consciously registering it. The weapon's sonic signature had become, for many, indistinguishable from danger itself. By late May 1944, with Allied forces finally breaking out of the beachhead and driving toward Rome, soldiers who had survived Anzio's 4-month ordeal carried forward a specific and lasting relationship with that particular sound, one that outlasted the physical danger itself. Veterans interviewed decades later frequently cited Anzio, rather than more famous battles, as the campaign where the sound first became something closer to a permanent psychological fixture, rather than simply a battlefield hazard to be survived and left behind. Rome fell on June 4th, 1944, offering a brief moment of celebration before world attention shifted entirely to events unfolding along the Normandy coast just 2 days later. June 6th, 1944, the beaches of Normandy, across 5 landing zones stretching along the Normandy coast, Allied soldiers experienced German machine gun fire with an intensity that instantly became the defining sound of the entire invasion. At Omaha Beach in particular, where the 352nd Infantry Division's concealed bunker positions swept the exposed sand with overlapping fields of MG42 fire, survivors described the weapon's sound as almost physically present, a wall of noise that seemed to press against the body rather than simply reach the ears. Yet it was not only Omaha where the sound left its mark. At Gold and Juno beaches, British and Canadian soldiers advancing against determined German resistance encountered the same distinctive tearing fire from fortified positions along the dunes, while at Sword Beach, British commandos pushing toward Caen found German machine gun teams integrated into hedgerows almost immediately upon moving inland, a preview of the punishing bocage fighting that would define the following weeks. War correspondents accompanying the invasion force, several of whom had covered earlier campaigns in North Africa and Italy, remarked in their dispatches on how uniformly soldiers across all 5 beaches described the same specific dread associated with the sound, regardless of nationality or unit. American, British, Canadian, and Free French troops alike had developed, independently and through hard experience, an identical visceral reaction to a weapon none of their own arsenals possessed an equivalent for. By nightfall on June 6th, over 150,000 Allied troops had come ashore, securing a foothold that would prove impossible for German forces to eliminate despite ferocious counterattacks in the days that followed. But the psychological imprint of that first day's fighting proved remarkably durable. Oral history projects conducted decades later consistently finding that D-Day veterans, when asked to describe their most vivid single memory of the entire war, disproportionately cited not visual images, but the sound of machine gun fire sweeping across the beach, a detail that photographs and film footage, however graphic, had never adequately conveyed to those who had not been there. As Allied forces pushed inland through Normandy's hedgerow country over the following weeks, that sound would follow them into terrain even less forgiving than the open beaches they had just survived. September 19th, 1944, the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. American forces advancing toward the Roer River entered a dense, dark woodland that would become one of the costliest and least celebrated battles of the entire European campaign. Thick stands of fir trees, planted in tight rows decades earlier for timber production, created a landscape where visibility rarely extended beyond a few dozen yards, and where German defenders had spent months preparing concealed positions among the trees themselves. The forest environment transformed the machine gun's already fearsome reputation into something soldiers described as uniquely disorienting. Sound behaved unpredictably among the dense trees, echoing and refracting in ways that made a single MG42 position seem to fire from multiple directions simultaneously, while the limited visibility meant soldiers frequently could not determine range or exact location, even when they could clearly hear the weapon firing nearby. American units, accustomed to more open terrain in Normandy, found their standard tactics poorly suited to the forest's claustrophobic conditions. Over nearly 3 months of fighting, stretching into December 1944, American forces suffered more than 33,000 casualties, pushing through roughly 50 square miles of forest, a grinding toll that later military historians would question as disproportionate to the terrain's actual strategic value. Soldiers who survived the Hürtgen frequently described it, when interviewed in later decades, as psychologically harder to endure than even Normandy's beaches, citing specifically the forest's acoustic properties and the way the machine gun sound seemed to stalk them through trees that offered concealment to the enemy far more effectively than they offered protection to the advancing Americans. By mid-December, exhausted units finally began pushing through the forest's remaining defences, but any sense of progress was interrupted almost immediately by a far larger German offensive gathering unseen just to the south, one that would draw many of these same battle-worn soldiers into an even more desperate winter battle within days of finally escaping the Hürtgen's trees. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the same forested terrain that had proven nearly impassable to armour 4 years earlier, catching thin American defensive lines almost entirely unprepared for an attack of this scale. Advancing infantry and armour pushed rapidly through initial American positions, MG42 teams once again anchoring nearly every defensive strongpoint German units established as they drove westward toward the Meuse River. Around the besieged town of Bastogne, American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division found themselves surrounded and cut off, enduring both brutal winter cold and near constant machine gun and artillery fire from German forces attempting to reduce the perimeter. Soldiers dug into frozen foxholes described the specific misery of the cold compounding the psychological weight of the machine gun's sound, bodies too numb to move quickly, reacting to a threat that demanded instant response. War correspondent accounts from Bastogne, along with letters soldiers wrote home during brief lulls in the fighting, repeatedly returned to descriptions of the sound cutting through otherwise profound silence. The muffling effect of heavy snowfall making the machine gun's report seem to arrive from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, an effect several veterans later compared to the acoustic disorientation they had first experienced in the Hürtgen's dense trees weeks earlier. By late December, as weather cleared enough to allow Allied air support to resume operations, and General Patton's Third Army fought through to relieve Bastogne's defenders, the offensive's momentum began collapsing under its own logistical strain, German forces increasingly hampered by dwindling fuel rather than any single tactical failure. The battle's outcome was decided by January 1945, but soldiers who fought through the Ardennes carried forward an additional layer to a sound memory that had, by this point in the war, become deeply embedded across nearly every Allied army fighting in Europe. As German forces retreated back toward their own borders through the war's final winter, that sound followed the fighting into Germany itself, accompanying the last, increasingly desperate defense of a collapsing Reich. March 1945. The banks of the Rhine River, Germany. Allied forces prepared to cross into Germany's heartland, the river crossing operations bringing soldiers face to face one final time with defensive positions manned by an increasingly desperate mixture of veteran troops, aging reservists and boys barely old enough to carry the weapons they had been issued. Even as German military capacity collapsed on nearly every front, the machine gun's psychological weight remained largely undiminished for soldiers experiencing it, regardless of how thin or poorly trained the crews behind it had become. Soldiers pushing through the rubble of German towns in the war's final weeks frequently described an unsettling contrast. The sound that had haunted them since Norway, since the desert, since Anzio's endless nights, now emerging from positions manned by exhausted teenagers and elderly militiamen, rather than the confident, well-trained crews of 1940. Yet the sound itself carried the same immediate instinctive terror it always had, a testament to how deeply that specific auditory signature had become wired into Allied soldiers' nervous systems after nearly 5 years of war. When Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, soldiers across every Allied army who had survived to see that day carried home something beyond simple relief. Post-war medical studies and oral history projects conducted over subsequent decades consistently found veterans describing the machine gun's sound as among their most persistent and involuntary memories, often triggered decades later by unrelated sharp, rapid noises, a car backfiring, fireworks, construction equipment, producing physical reactions their families struggled to understand. Historians studying combat psychology have since noted that few single-sensory details from the entire war appear as consistently across so many separate oral history archives, spanning soldiers from vastly different backgrounds, nationalities, and theatres of the European campaign. From the fjords above Narvik in 1940 to the ruins along the Rhine in 1945, the machine gun's distinctive tearing report became something closer to a shared nervous system among Allied soldiers, a sound that outlasted the guns themselves, the uniforms that fired them, and even the war that had first taught an entire generation what true terror actually sounded like.